Welcome to What is Going Om, for new thought from the edge of Om. Each week on OMTimes' flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Om. Here is your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. If you're intrigued by ancient mysteries, prepare to have your mind shaken and stirred, because today we're taking a deep dive into some tantalizing questions, such as what is religion, and why are so many churches, temples and cathedrals built upon sites that were considered sacred to others? And how did the Egyptian writing system of hieroglyphs come into existence? Why are there so many strange similarities between various world's religions and hero myths? And what are the connections between the Earth's resonant frequencies, sacred sites, human consciousness, and the origins of religion? My guest today is independent academic, historian, and author David Elkington, whose highly acclaimed books include The Case for the Jordan Codices, co-authored with Professor Philip Davies, Discovering the Lead Codices, or the Lead Codices rather, the Book of Seven Seals and the Secret Teachings of Jesus, and the Ancient Language of Sacred Sound, the Acoustic Science of the Divine, which has been held as presenting a case for a far more interesting history than we currently know, while breaking new ground in ancient knowledge of the hidden patterns of the universe. David Elkington, welcome.
Hi, Sandy. It's good to be on your show. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, you're so welcome, David. What a book. My goodness. Well, you're a founder member of the Foundation for the Research and Preservation of the Lead Codices, a controversial book and yet important discovery. Your subject matter covers all things biblical and Egyptological, with a specialisation in the resonance patterns at ancient holy sites. You've lectured at Oxford and Cambridge and appeared on Coast to Coast and Forbidden History, to name just two of many radio and TV appearances. And you've spent years travelling the world in pursuit of answers to questions that have plagued curious minds for centuries. What inspired this passionate quest of yours?
It's a very easy question to answer, actually, because I found myself, when I was a young man, those days that were far off, wandering through the nave of Wells Cathedral, which is a Gothic cathedral built in the 12th and 13th centuries in Western England. And I just emerged from a love affair, and quite heartbroken, really, and found myself walking idly through the nave when I saw a very large door to the left, and just felt intrigued enough to open it. And as I approached, it said, to the chapter house. And as I opened the door, there in front of me was this very, very ancient staircase, so well worn that it seems as if the steps were bending, almost sponge-like, at the foot's tread. As I actually ascended that staircase, trying to make my way into the chapter house, I could hear the sound of music. It was a choir practicing for the Christmas carol concert, and they were singing medieval hymns. And suddenly, at around about a third of the way up the staircase, I suddenly felt myself completely transported into a world that I'd never experienced or known before. And it was utterly profound. And in that state, I seemed to be very receptive. I suddenly seemed to know everything at once. I seemed to know neither sorrow nor joy, but a kind of a higher joy, something that took me right out of myself. And I actually felt as if I was floating above myself, let alone the staircase. The experience didn't last for very long. I'd say all of 5 or 10 minutes at most. And when I came down from that staircase and back out of the door again, I was not only in floods of tears at the sheer beauty of what I'd heard, but was profoundly taken by the question of what exactly had happened to me. And so the book, The Ancient Language of Sacred Sound, is the direct result of that experience.
What were you planning for your life before that experience?
I planned to have a career in advertising and television, and then probably to, at some stage or other, change career and become an Egyptologist and go into the ancient history field. But unfortunately, other things took their toll on me. I suddenly ended up with severe bad health, which took quite a long time to actually overcome. But however, that gave me the good grace to devote my time directly to the ancient historical side of things. I trained as an Egyptologist privately in London back in the mid-80s. And that then took me into the field of acoustics and looking at other aspects of ancient history, wherein I was more interested in the idea that we interact with our planet and with the sacred sites than the fact that we just build them and then let them succumb to political ideas and off we go. It seemed to me to make absolutely no sense. And if you look at the Great Pyramid, let alone the Gothic cathedrals, it's almost as if they're built so perfectly that it seems to defy the general principle of ancient history that actually they have nothing to offer us in terms of our view of ourselves.
I mean, it is interesting when we go to ancient sites and ancient buildings, is that, quite often we look at them in awe, but we think of them as something that was, so magnificent, that was created in the past before we think people had the ability to create anything magnificent. But we don't think about them as something that, that's alive today.
Because we're brainwashed into thinking that we live in such a progressive society.
Yes.
But actually, is it? You've got to question this. When you look at the past and you look at the way in which it seems to almost be similar in parts to some of our own technological breakthroughs, I'm inclined to see history as less than a line from BC to AD, and more as a series of spirals like springs, where at one point on the spiral we are matched in the past by another point on the spiral, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and your book certainly points out how alive everything is, and the thoughts that we may have. We may admire some of the gifts of the artisans and the architects and the builders who built some of those monuments, but we don't really think of them as having this knowledge beyond what we have.
I think that they're temples to consciousness. I think they are carved out of consciousness by people who are themselves becoming self-conscious. Sound is a profound thing in tandem with the human ability to sing, the profundity of the human voice. So it seems to me that having, I think, evolved in the embrace of Mother Earth at the cave site, when we emerge from the caves, we actually go on to build not schools, not shopping malls, not banks. The first thing we build is the sacred place. And the question you have to ask is why? And the answer to that is likely because we wanted to stay in touch with the being that we call Mother Earth. And therefore, we're still very much within her embrace. Now, it's interesting because experiments have shown that there are naturally 4 states of the brain that go from beta, theta, alpha and delta, all the way from 0.5 hertz, which is a delta rhythm, to 4 hertz, all the way up to a waking state of 30 hertz or vibrations per second. Now, curiously enough, I'm not sure if your audience would be familiar with this, but we actually go on through the experience of an altered state at least once a day, most likely twice a day. And that's when we come out of sleep and we go through what's called the alpha state, which is where the brain is vibrating at approximately between 7 and 13 vibrations or hertz per second. And it's in this state that knowledge seems to come to us, which is why they say that if you have a problem, you should sleep on it, because in that state you are able to make connections that you wouldn't in your normal everyday state, where you think and you see right ahead, but you don't see to the left, you don't see to the right. So in this sense, when you then go into the sacred place, be it a church, cathedral, temple, pyramid, you name it, these places were built to alter your brainwave patterns so that you then could become one with the site. And in that state, you can then draw down the knowledge or the wisdom from the heavens that you feel you are fit to receive, because wisdom is always a gift. And that's why my thesis in the book is that the hero, who is always associated with these extraordinary places, he is the son of the Earth Mother and the Sky Father, and he is the arbiter between us and them, in other words, the arbiter between humanity and God. And it is always the hero who undergoes the near-death experience at these places in order to draw down knowledge. And it seems to me as well that if you look carefully at these legends, it also says that it's the hero who brings the ability to write script. And when I looked at this, and having performed numerous experiments looking at the cymatic or visual sound patterns in dust and sand worldwide, every time we went into a monument, be it from India, being it from Egypt, from Celtic Ireland, mainland Europe, you name it, we always seem to have the script of those particular civilizations appearing in the sand. And that seemed to tell me that the invention of script, the ability to leave a note for your milkman, is not something that we actually invented. It's actually more of an environmental response mechanism. And indeed, that's borne out by a strange collection of cellular structures in the brain called the neurides, which actually do take, in Western Europe, alphabetic shape.
Yeah. It's astonishing, some of the, the book it's not often I read a book and I kind of walk around in a daze afterwards because I'm trying to process all of the information in that book. And it's like things are popping off in my head and going, oh, this relates to that. And in my experience, it is a standout book. And it is one that takes you to a place within yourself that is very, very deep. And I think it does actually take time for one to process and allow that information to do. I mean, we're talking about words, and you talk about the power of words and the power of sound, and the written word in the book is actually having that effect, certainly on me as I'm reading it.
Well, let's not forget as well that the hero was a poet. And poetry also involves the rhythms of sound and its effect upon human consciousness. We're all affected by the lyrics of our favorite songs. We're all affected by great poetry. We are affected hugely by the very words we speak. And yet we take them so much for granted that we little understand both their history and quite often their meaning. I can give you some good examples of that. I mean, the most obvious is that in the wonderful opening to the Gospel of St. John, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now, if you now go to the Latin language and look up the term one word, you will end up with our common word, universe. This is quite remarkable stuff. Yeah, and then, of course, if we go even further than that, we go around looking for treasure. A quest is an adventure to look for treasure. Well, look up the word treasure in your dictionary, and you'll find it comes from the French and Latin trésor. And trésor is where we get our term for a thesaurus. In other words, a collection of words. So in other words, the treasure is in the meanings of the very words we are using. And I would advise your your readers, and I say this as a game more than as a self-criticism of the book, grab hold of a really good dictionary, because look at some of the words for yourself and go to the end of each insert on the words and look at where they come from and what they mean. It'll take you back even further in time, and you'll begin to see new connections between things. It really is very remarkable. I looked up the word God at one stage. It comes from the German Gott, and then that in itself comes from the Sanskrit Guth, which basically means voice. Again, it all goes back to sound. So, there's a massive, massive treasure there waiting for everybody to delve into and to appreciate and to understand, but never forget the poetry of language and the fact that we use it to sing at these extraordinary places that come alive with the use of the word.
Yes, and that's the point you make. When people sing or pray aloud at some of these places, it actually activates the energy there.
Yes, they do. I mean, these places have to be switched on. We have lots of historical examples of places like the pyramids, the temple in Jerusalem. Today we see them as dead ruins. We go there to view them because they're silent in their antiquity. But actually they were once living, breathing places, and it wouldn't be too much to reactivate them. We think of these places as places of slave labor, where people got together to build these monuments to the egos of past tyrants and kings. Actually, we couldn't be further from the truth. You don't build monuments to hate with such loving care and attention as we did temples and pyramids. We all took part in the building of them because we knew that in the building of them they would achieve and attain one specific purpose, to alter us. It's interesting, actually, that the center of a church is called an altar. There's another link for you. But a curious point in all of this is that one of the great mysteries of European civilization is that from the 11th century onwards, we had the building of the Gothic cathedrals, which happened everywhere. Now, we don't yet understand the economics of it, because these places were not inexpensive to construct. But however, once they were constructed, and you've got to consider the people of the time, they had no computers, no cameras, there was no technology, no telephones. These were people, in large part, who wandered from county to county as craftsmen, erecting these extraordinary structures out of all manner of stone and glass, and suddenly the Gothic comes along with its pointed arches that finally allows us to break away from the heaviness of the Romanesque buildings and their thick walls, their small windows, their lack of light. The Gothic suddenly opens up the place with dramatic infusions of light, as if it's a living crystal. And suddenly, as St. Bernard of Clairvaux said, you have a book in stone. And that's exactly what they were. I mean, perhaps today, a better way of translating that term would be that it's a CD-ROM. It's more like an interactive experience, which it was to those people at the time. And it's extraordinary that within a century of the completion of the building of these monuments, that we had the rise of the Renaissance, and then after that the Enlightenment, and so on and so forth. Because people had been going into these places in their droves, in their thousands, in their tens of thousands, and they had been switched on. It changed the pattern of humanity. It changed the way we think. And look what it led to.
You also talk about the materials that were used in these buildings and the glass. I mean, I was fascinated to read about the way that glass was made and the quality of the glass in these Gothic cathedrals, which is nothing like the glass we use today. And, the colour, the way the colour and the glass and the frequency of all of those all had meaning and all had power.
All these people were masters of what they did. I mean, the fact of the matter is today we have no idea as to how some of this pigmentation was actually achieved. Some of it is so utterly fine in terms of its grinding that today we can only think that it could only have been done by a machine. Yet it wasn't. They didn't have those machines in that day. So there's much that we don't know. But, you know, their use of these materials is very stunning. It's very dramatic. I don't know if your readers know this, but glass is actually a liquid crystal. It is not a solid crystal. And if you go to a cathedral, and if you've got the good fortune to see a really ancient piece of glass, you'll see that where it's been standing up for such a long time, as you look down at it from the side, you'll see that it's bulbous at the bottom rather than at the top, because over time it has moved. It has actually moved to the extent where gravity is actually telling on it. Now, the ability of the makers to use these materials to guide the sun's rays to the deep interior of these monuments is even more dramatic. At Chartres Cathedral, on the winter solstice and on the summer solstice, the sun will shine through the main rose window directly onto the labyrinth. And it was on that labyrinth on specific days of the year that the dean and chapter would actually gather, and they would sing the Te Deum Laudamus whilst actually throwing a golden ball betwixt each other, a ball representing the sun and its transit around the heavens. So in other words, these places could actually predict the agricultural outcome for the year into the bargain. And not only that, they chose stone, they chose limestone, they chose sandstone, and they chose granite, all for its acoustic properties. They knew exactly how to manipulate these materials. Pretty remarkable people, considering they were supposed to be so primitive.
So these sites, I mean, long before they became churches and cathedrals, what made them sacred? It's a combination of the energy, the quality of the earth, the intention, the people who are using it.
It's all of those things put together. I found also that they're generally built on lines of force, where generally you will have water wells beneath them, and the water itself will generally be heavily laced in radon gas, which is a natural earth gas, which is what they call a noble gas. It doesn't interact with any others, but it's naturally radioactive. And that this actually is what comprises holy water. In an experiment done in the late 1990s, the Anglian Water Authority of Eastern England took a glass of ordinary tap water, a glass of river water, and a glass of water from a holy well, and introduced bacterium into all three glasses. In the river water and the tap water, it spread phenomenally, but in the holy well water, it died instantly. So again, these extraordinary medieval folk knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew quite how holy the well water was. And in fact, if you come to the UK or Europe on a winter's morning, just before the light's coming up, you'll quite often see the fog of radon gas above holy well water actually illuminating before the sun comes up. It's quite remarkable.
There's one particular story that really fascinated me about material, and I don't know if it was the material itself or whether it was the hieroglyph symbol of the heart, the Egyptian hieroglyph for the heart on the jar. But
yes, the water jar that was used to purify water. Yes, that's right. It created vortices within the water. The water introduced could be incredibly badly polluted, but by the time it had been sweated out of the jar, it was more than drinkable. Again, an extraordinary piece of technology that could be used to huge effect today, even. And the fact that the jar itself was actually in the shape of the hieroglyph for the heart is extraordinary. And, this is something else we have to pay attention to. We must not look down upon our ancestors because, we are no better, no worse than they are. We're merely in a different place. And we should therefore listen to their guidance and their wisdom as well as their insights into these things, in order to help ourselves with where we are today.
Well, we'd be a much healthier and happier society, wouldn't we?
It certainly would be.
We're going to take a short break now, David. You're listening to What Is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and my guest today is independent academic and historian David Elkington, who's sharing some of the startling revelations shared in his book, The Ancient Language of Sacred Sound, in which he uncovers the similarities between nearly all religions and shows what their common goal was, which is to get man closer to his God through the power of voice, sound, and the resulting resonance at certain religious locations. We'll be back with more from David Elkington after this break.
The future of Internet radio is here. OMTimes Radio, IOM FM. Being a radio host on IOM FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the Internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network.
Vox Novus, the new voice. Vox Novus, the new dimension. Vox Novus, thought and movement leaders who will share from their experience and offer tools to help us navigate our rapidly changing world. My name is Victor Furman. Join me every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio for Vox Novus, the new voice.
Mental health. Most people think it means mental illness. Most people are wrong. Mental health doesn't apply to just some of us. It applies to everyone. We're all susceptible to anxiety and depression. They're human conditions, and no person should ever feel embarrassed, ashamed, or be discriminated against for being human. Cracked the podcast strips away the shame, fear, and stigma by expanding the conversation into areas less often visited. From brain and body chemistry, hormones, food, nutrition, trauma, and the microbiome, to pharmaceutical drugs, psychedelic substances, meditation, visionary experiences, and spiritual awakenings. Cracked the podcast will explore them all, including the notion that, for many, breakdown can be the beginning of breakthrough. For in the words of singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen, there is a crack in everything. It's where the light gets in. Cracked the podcast, slaying the dragons of mental health. Join co-hosts Sandie Sedgbeer and Rebecca Shaper on the first and third Thursday of every month at 12 noon Eastern Time.
Coping-19, brought to you by CDC and the Ad Council.
If you're feeling increasingly lonely right now, you're not alone. It's totally normal. Even though we may not be able to get together in person, connecting virtually with friends and family still gives you a chance to interact with people and may help raise your spirits. Join a virtual book club, set up group text chats, or online video coffee breaks with coworkers.
Find more self-care and coping tips at coping-19.org.
Welcome back. David Elkington, I want to go back to hieroglyphics, which you say were known as the words of the god. Hieroglyphics, I want to read a little bit from your book. You say, the first thing that struck me about hieroglyphs was how unconscious they seemed. Now, this may be an odd thing to say about these enigmatic symbols, but something about them goes straight to the mind, as if something primordial were trying to get through. In a word, the experience is magical. I went into a temple at Damanhur in Italy a few years ago. These temples have been built by some of the community over a number of years. And one of these temples had, the whole walls were covered in symbols, writing. And I walked into that room and immediately I got very confused because something in my brain said, you know this, you should be able to read it. But I couldn't make sense of it. And I think that's what you're talking about, isn't it?
If you look at the work of the surrealist painter René Magritte, you'll get the same feeling. And he sometimes uses hieroglyphs in the same way. So there is something primordial about them. That's absolutely for sure. They are an extraordinary language, and I sometimes wonder if it's because we all have a vague memory of being in Egypt ourselves at some time in the deep and ancient past. But, of course, the word hieroglyph literally means sacred writing. So, of course, there you have it. But also we mustn't forget, too, that in terms of being sacred, they were therefore for use liturgically speaking. In other words, they were used with sacred intent. So if we come back to the idea of acoustics and the role of acoustics and sound at the sacred place, and therefore we now have script as the manifestation of those acoustics, now you can see the true role of hieroglyphs at the very outset. They actually maintain the substance of place and they reveal it at the same time. So, of course, what we've got here, in a sense, is another manifestation of those extraordinary entities that we call the gods. They're manifesting in a form in which we can see them, and it's in a way in which we can then use that gift from them, the gift of script, which gives us wisdom, so that we can then communicate with each other without any of us having to be present to speak to each other, which I think in days of old, certainly 3 or 4, 5, 6,000 years ago, must have seemed entirely miraculous. And therefore, the other part of the miracle being that they actually emerge from within the sacred site. That must have had a power all of its own. And that's what I find so extraordinary about them. And then when John Stuart Reid was doing his experiments deep inside the Great Pyramid in 1998, I was there when he emerged with the extraordinary images that had come up on the membrane atop the sarcophagus. They were absolutely astonishing, breathtaking, in fact. He'd gone in to check the acoustics of the interior of the pyramid, and basically had come out with a whole list of superlatives. First of all, the pyramid is acoustically perfect, which is almost impossible. At places like Chartres Cathedral or in your ordinary sitting room, you would have an acoustic signature that might go something like 110 hertz, 0.054, etc., etc. But if you go to the Great Pyramid, when you stand at the bottom of the Grand Gallery, it's 125 hertz perfectly. You go halfway up, it's 250. You enter into the King's Chamber, it's 500. And it's a perfect 0, 0, 0, 0 all round. So that is absolutely astonishing in itself. And then taking those internal frequencies, he then put an acoustic power meter into an amplifier into the sarcophagus, covered it with a membrane, and then scattered sand on top of that. Now, before I go any further, I should say that having done a white noise test in the chamber, John found that the standing wave pattern matched precisely the length of the sarcophagus, and also that the sarcophagus was in exactly the right place for the standing wave. It's a wave in which, if you stand in the midst of it, almost all is quiet. You take a move an inch or two above it, you're suddenly surrounded in noise. It's a most extraordinary phenomenon. So then, having discovered that, he then took those frequencies and fired it at the membrane, and the next thing you know is you've got a series of hieroglyphs. And they are extraordinary. We had the Eye of Ra, which is the creator god of Egypt. We had the Eye of Horus, which of course is the very, very famous glyph for the son of Osiris. We had the backbone of the god Osiris. And at one point, John also had the double Eye of Horus, which is known as the Neber-Jer. And when I brought that back to the UK to speak to my then professor, Professor Christine El Mahdi at the British School of Egyptology, she fainted absolutely cold. I had to go to my kitchen sink and get an emergency glass of water. She came round and I said, "Is everything okay?" And she said, "I've never seen this before. This is quite extraordinary." And I said, well, what does it mean? And she said, for the Egyptians, this is the holy, ineffable name of God. It is the forbidden word. She said, and you've managed to manifest it within the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid. She said, now we know why it was built. And that was, I think, the culmination point of the entire quest. And that's why I put it at the very end of the book. It was an absolutely astonishing moment.
It must have been. My goodness, yes. Was it not John who also did some work at Roslin Chapel?
Yes, we did a whole bundle of experiments. We did work all over the place, Abbotsbury, in Dorset, and a number of other places. And again, we came up with glyphs that matched the culture within which these monuments had been constructed, which was entirely extraordinary. And again, it just verifies my point. These places were built with purpose and with intent. And the intent, finally, was to alter human civilization.
There's, talking about words and symbols, there's people dismiss it as New Age psychobabble. Things that you can get to stick on your water bottle. Peace, health, love, those kinds of things. The words and some symbols as well. And obviously, Masaru Emoto's work with sound and speaking, to rice and various different things, and how they all change, character according to whether the words used are loving words or not so loving words. Where does that fit in with all of this? Because it's all been dismissed.
I think it's absolutely crucial to everything to do with the work that we're talking about. We mustn't forget that in order to be a true seer within these monuments that were constructed, it wasn't simply a matter of going in and having your brainwave patterns altered. It was actually a matter of actually mastering that which you were seeing. And that could only come about through diet and proper intake of fluids and food. And that fluid and that food also had to be pure. So, of course, another aspect of this would be the intent within eating that food. Now, this is something which is very, very common in Eastern cultures, particularly in India and in the Buddhist cultures and the Hindu cultures, but not so common in the West, where we give scant regard to such things, because they had a much more whole approach. Here, we have a piecemeal approach. And it's funny, it's not New Age at all. Science is suddenly realizing that actually there is definitely something to this. They're beginning to realize now, and in fact there's a massive change of paradigm going on as I speak, and that is the fact that we, the observer, do actually affect the outcome of any experimental results. So in other words, we cannot detach ourselves from that which we are observing. Now, quantum theory backs that up precisely. To my mind, we've been very, very slow to accept quantum theory's observations into our everyday working principles of science. So the idea that water can actually be shaped by our intent, I think is not only feasible but true, and it's been shown that the very food you eat, be it vegetables or meat or whatever you eat, if you actually do bless it before you eat it, it's been shown to be the case that the field around that food will palpably change. So in other words, it's your intent again that is altering things. And it's also altering your life. And I sometimes wonder about things like cancers and other illnesses, as to whether actually by being more accepting of the wider world and phenomena, not seeing ourselves as being superior, but being more humble to other forms of life and thanking it for being there, and doing so from the heart, not from the brain, by reaching outwards emotionally to it, whether we ourselves become a lot more stable in order to actually overcome disease, which actually we should pronounce properly as dis-ease. In other words, we're not very at ease with it. So again, words give us the clue, they also give us the answer.
Absolutely. You've done a lot of research on words and names, and over again in your book you show how certain names or traces of those names repeat themselves in different cultures, different religions, different heroes, etc. There's a very interesting story that Robert Watts, the film producer who worked on Star Wars and Indiana Jones, tells about in the foreword that he wrote to the updated version of the book, where he was just blown away because he's been fascinated by these subjects for a long time. But when he realised that one of the words you used matched very much a very important word we all know from Star Wars, and perhaps you want to tell us this story, he just couldn't believe it.
Robert was quite stunned, I have to say.
Yeah.
We were introduced by a very dear friend of mine who lives in Los Angeles, and it was quite some years ago. And I gave Robert a copy of the book, and then he got to that point, and he phoned me, and he said, David, he said, I've got to tell you, we had no idea, he said, when George called them Jedi Knights, he said, I had no idea that the actual word Jedi actually existed. And I said, yes. I said, in fact, it was why I called the chapter Return of the Jed and I, in the hope that somehow a copy would get to you chaps. Turns out that Jedi, or Jedi, is actually the earliest known name for the god Osiris, the dying and rising god of Egypt, who is now a judge of the dead, and the husband of the blessed Isis. Now, Osiris is actually a Greek version of his name, which in the earliest dynasties is called Jedi, and the Jed itself is actually the backbone of the god. It is actually a pillar, an architectural pillar, which you'll quite often see in Egyptian symbolism. But Osiris himself was actually called Asar. But of course, jumping onto the bus ride, using vowels for sacred names was just not the done thing in those days. Humans can only pronounce these things sacredly with the use of a consonant. And of course, that would either be a Y or a J. So Asar actually becomes Jizar or Jizu. And it's interesting because the Great Pyramid was known in its earliest times as the place of the Ascension. And it's very significant that actually it's based near Cairo because, of course, to those who are very familiar with Christian history, the sign that the Emperor Constantine the Great saw in the sky before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in the early 300s AD was called the Kai Rho, which basically came to him and said, in this sign you will conquer. And it was said to be the sign that actually converted him to Christianity. So, in a sense, St. Augustine was right when he said that Christianity predated the time of Jesus, that in fact Christ and Jesus had been in the same myth all the way along across the planet, because that's something I discovered for myself. I even found a god in ancient Japan called Jizu who underwent the same experience. Quite the most extraordinary thing.
It is indeed. It makes me wonder then, the way we toss words around. We're oblivious to it, but names, in a lot of fairy tales and mythology, you do not give your name to a stranger because you are giving your power away to them.
That's very true. We have that in one of the oldest legends of the goddess Isis. One day, the sun god Ra, who is also the creator god, is stung by a scorpion, probably sent by Isis herself. He's in the heel. The heel, strangely enough, is said to be one of the departure points of the body for the soul, which can either exit at death through the crown of the head, the small of the back, or through the left heel, exactly where Ra himself was stung by the scorpion, which, by the way, is symbolic of the god Set, the god of disorder in Egypt. And so, of course, Isis says, well, I have the cure, so I'll cure you, but only if you'll give me your secret name. Now, that's quite a bit of blackmail. And unfortunately, Ra thought, okay, fine, I'll give it to you. And he did. But, it's another testimony to the power of things. In the ancient Jewish religion, the secret holy name of God was absolutely forbidden to be spoken by anybody if they knew it, upon pain of instantaneous death. The scene in Monty Python's Life of Brian, where Michael Palin, as that character, is about to be stoned. He said, I don't know why they're going to stone me. All I said was that halibut was good enough for Jehovah. And suddenly, of course, they're all throwing their stones at him. That was based on actual historical fact. Names and gods are very powerful things. And to ancient peoples, they could only be chanted or uttered within the environs of the sacred space. And that's why I believe the god names were kept secret, because somehow they seem to activate that space and to alter us.
Well, in numerology, if you change the spelling of your name or you change your name, you change everything.
Yes, indeed. And I mean, recent studies into the idea of consciousness and the state of matter suggests that it's all an illusion, because on a quantum level it's all just basically a heap of vibrations, so that really nothing is real. So yes, we can alter the world around us, we can alter the state we're in. The world we're looking at is an illusion. So you might as well make the illusion a damn sight more comfortable and a lot more tolerable by making it beautiful and joyous. Because I certainly don't want to live in a place of misery, death, and destruction. I'm sure most of your listeners don't too.
Absolutely. In the last less than 10 minutes that we have, I want you to talk a little bit about sound and matter and blood, which again brings us back to that Egyptian water jar, because that part of it is absolutely fascinating. I think we need to know this.
It's curious, you say that, because another thing about the water jar is it's very reflective of the human body. When we look at the fact that the jar is in the form of the human heart, according to the Egyptian hieroglyph for the heart, if you think about the blood flowing through your body, most of us think it goes in a straight line down the veins and into the arteries and so on and so forth. It does no such thing. For a start, blood actually runs in spiral-type motions, creating vortices that flow throughout our entire system. And anything that spins gives off a charge. So therefore, that charge creates a field around the human body. If you actually bind somebody's eyes, stop their ears, and take perception of the outside away from them, and then somebody enters into the room silently, so that the person bound can't hear them, they will still be able to know when their presence has entered the room, because their fields have interacted. This is the astonishing power of acoustics and vibration. Sound can affect even that. Your field can actually penetrate walls. It can penetrate material items. When you're sitting at a computer, your computer is giving off a huge field that you can detect through very, very thick stone walls, which is why, again, people sometimes use large lumps of quartz to try and iron out some of that field intolerance that they get, and it does work. We found that quartz, which is used quite often at the sacred sites, has an extraordinary power of its own. In the book, I describe an experiment with 2 daffodil bulbs. The one bulb was put beneath a window, and another was put to the side of a large lump of quartz. The daffodil that sprouted from the bulb under the window sprouted directly upwards towards the sunlight. But the bulb that was to the side of the lump of quartz didn't go towards the light, it went towards the quartz, again attracted by its field. So again, ancient humanity, in using quartz at these sites, knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the power of these things. And there's another thing as well I describe in the book, that there's a piece of magnetite in our face, actually, in the ethmoid bone, which if you go to the bridge of the nose and go back about 1 or 2 centimeters, it's located about there. And that gives us our sense of direction. It helps to create a magnetic field wherein we know where we're located and how we're going to get somewhere. I couldn't work out, as an Egyptologist, why, during the process of mummification, that bridge of the nose was pierced in order to extract the brain. Because when a mummy lays down, it's always in a horizontal format that we find it. What would happen, therefore, is that the brain itself would actually decompose into about 2 or 3 tablespoons full of a very thick liquor that will reside in the base of that bulbous part at the back of the head. So there would be no need to actually pierce the nose. And I suddenly realized, of course, that the reason the brain was removed is because actually the process of breaking through the bridge of the nose was to remove the magnetite and therefore allow the soul its release to go onwards into the afterworld.
Is there any connection between what you said and trepanning when they bore a hole through that part of the third eye in some mental patients? I mean, we've seen that, bones have been found, skulls have been found where that's been used.
Yes, you're talking about trepanning.
Yeah.
Actually, I haven't looked into it. I'd very much like to see the effectiveness of it. We know that trepanning and such so-called primitive surgeries were actually highly effective in their day. So it would be worth looking into, actually. There was another phenomenon I discovered as well, and that was the origin of mermaids. Now, this is a hypothesis, but I realized that in the Great Pyramid, when the Wayman-Dixon brothers had gone into the pyramid in the 1860s, they'd actually realized that in the King's Chamber there are 2 shafts that are actually open. They're called ventilation shafts. We don't really know what they actually are. But in the Queen's Chamber they were closed, and they managed to tap the walls and find the location of 2 further shafts there. And in those shafts they found a couple of things, but amongst them was what they call a pesh-en-kef knife. Now, significantly, this knife has the form of a mermaid's tail. And I realized that basically it would be used by midwives for cutting the umbilicus of a newborn child. So therefore, the old pharaoh would die. He would become Osiris, who was the father of Horus, because the living pharaoh was called the Horus king. So in other words, he was reborn as Horus from Osiris. So in other words, here on earth, his son would take over. He would become the new Horus king, and therefore he would go through a rebirth ritual in which the pesh-en-kef knife was used to actually cut his spiritual umbilicus. So it was welcome to this world. And therefore, when we look at the mermaid's tail, and we look at the ancient Egyptian word for a pyramid, pyramid, of course, is a Greek word, but in ancient Egyptian, the word for the pyramid was the mer. So, of course, what we have is the maid of the mer. She's a midwife. And, of course, she would have been singing her siren song in the action of doing this. And I suspect that this is where the myth of the mermaid comes from. Because when Pharaoh's soul, the soul of the dead Pharaoh, would then be launched through the shafts into the great sea of the cosmos, that's where the mermaids were sending him on his way. So that when they say in the legend, the mermaid will drag you down to the depths, literally that is the case. But the depths are not the briny sea that we are so familiar with, it's the depths of the cosmic ocean itself.
Yeah. David, we're pretty much out of time. Just in a very few words, what do you want readers to take away from this book?
It's been a great experience being on, and thank you so much.
You didn't answer my question.
What? Sorry, I didn't hear it. Do apologise.
Oh, okay. I wanted to know, what do you want readers most to take away from this book?
I'd like them to take away a greater sense that there's much more to the world than they're being taught to believe by mainstream media these days. I want them to take away joy. I want them to take away a great sense of awe at everything around us and a greater respect for other forms of life other than that which is human. If we could do that and then begin to appreciate the world around us and partake in it more, we might change ourselves and our planet into the bargain for the better.
Well said, David. David Elkington, thank you for joining us today.
You're very welcome.
The Ancient Language of Sacred Sound, The Acoustic Science of the Divine by David Elkington is published by Inner Traditions. You can find more information about David's research and the Jordan Codices on the Facebook page, The Jordan Codices. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer. You can learn more about me and the No BS Spiritual Book Club at sedgbeer.com. Meantime, I'll be back with another edition of What is Going On at the same time next week. Till then, it's goodbye from me.